Alright, so since that I had my recent LM2 overclocking session with the Gulftown 980X, I thought about making a sequel video to my legendary Motherboards video lineup. And since that I haven't made any newer videos since the Gigabyte EP45T Extreme, I thought about making a video of one of the most legendary motherboards of all time in the history of overclocking, and if not the most legendary motherboard of all time, since this motherboard was really built from the ground up for pure overclocking purposes, especially on the Gulftown 32nm CPUs. So this is the Gigabyte GA-X58A overclock. So this is the first board with the OC segmented orange and black color scheme. This came in quite late to the market. I mean, considering the LGA 1366 days. So this was released in quite early 2011. So it came in quite late, as the LGA 2011 or X79 was already coming out to the market in late 2011. So this was like only 8 months at the top before it was passed away by a newer platform from Intel. So there are real reasons why this board does have some good value and purpose if you want to push the X58 CPUs to the max even today. And so I could talk a little bit about the overall features of this board, my personal experiences with this board, and how does this compare to the other top models from other vendors, mainly the Asus Rampage 3 Extreme and Black Edition. So I don't really remember what was the original price of this board, but it was quite expensive. Even though this doesn't really have that many features for daily purposes, this really doesn't have like that many connectivity options at all. It barely comes with any audio at all, so it's very minimal and only single networking and not that many like USB options or other connectivity options at the back. So this is really stripped down motherboard, although a lot of working hours went into this board, so that way it wasn't that cheap. I think the price was 300 something euros back in 2011. So this board was really targeted for use with the Gulftown 980X and 990X, and not that much with the original 45nm quad-core Bloomfields, as the main, the key highlight of this whole platform at the end of its days was just the 6-core Gulftowns, because the Sandy Bridge came in early 2011 and it made all the previous quad cores useless, as Sandy Bridge really had huge IPC improvements over the previous quad-core X58 CPUs, as well as the quad-core P55 CPUs, and you could really overclock the Sandy Bridge CPUs high. So the only real advantage of this particular platform was that you had 6-core CPUs available to this platform. You had triple channel memory, so you could get better workstation builds on this platform, and you had more PCI Express lanes on these X58 CPUs, so you could do larger multi-GPU builds with this platform. So I got this board maybe 2 years ago in its original packaging, so this wasn't a bulk board, so I can use the original packaging to highlight some of the key features of this board. So many people still bought this board for daily purposes just because of this unique and brand new orange and black color scheme, although the newer models in this color scheme lineup weren't this stripped down as the original X58A-OC, like the Gigabyte GA-X59UD7 or the Ivy Bridge Z77X-UP7. Those weren't that stripped down. They had the good features for overclocking, but at the same time they had good audio, good networking, all the things that you would really utilize in your daily rigs. So even in my opinion, this is a little bit too stripped down model overall, because even a guy like me, of course I want the good aspect for overclocking, but I also want the ability to use it well in normal situations as well, because most guys use the same models in their daily rigs what they also use for overclocking purposes. So that way this is a little bit maybe too stripped down, I think. But when just looking at the board, it has very nice black PCB, and it probably has the strongest VRM of all X58 motherboards out there. So this has a double 6-phase intersil VRM for the CPU. The packaging states that it can draw up to 1500 watt through these two or these dual EPS 8-pin power connectors, and it can output up to 1200 watts for the CPU. I have to say that all the X58 CPUs, like the quad-core Bloomfields as well as the 6-core Gulftown, they really draw a lot of power on LN2 when you really run them high for multi-core benchmarks like W prime. When I was running the 980X at around minus 160 degrees Celsius at speeds of 6.6 gigahertz with 1.85 volts or so, it really drew a lot of power, and it was really tough to maintain the temperature. So in that regard, it's really nice to have a good VRM on a buff board like this, and of course with dual 8-pin connectors, so the single connector and cable don't really, doesn't really heat up that much. The X58 Northbridge is located under here, under this heatsink here. It has 3-phase power for the Northbridge, and I think it's 2-phase power for the memory. So this is a triple channel memory layout and 6 memory slots. Since that this was this stripped down motherboard overall, I really wonder even today that why they didn't go for a single slot per channel design, as the original Foxconn Blood Rage motherboard for X58, which came in like at the very early days of X58 in 2008, that had single slot per channel design. So they could have thought about that even in back in 2011. So they could just use these 3 slots here. They would all be closer to the CPU, they would have less latency, and they could at least theoretically get better memory speeds even with those old DDR3 sticks. But actually the single slot per channel design didn't really help that much at all back in DDR3 days. We had some boards that had only 1 slot per channel instead of 2, and the overall difference was very, very small, especially when last days of DDR3 on the mainstream socket, for example the ASRock Z97OC formula versus the Gigabyte Z97 LN2 board or Maximus 7 Impact. The overall difference in the end, even with the memory running on LN2, was very, very small. I think the only difference between Maximus 7 Impact and the ASRock board, as ASRock had all 4 DIMM slots, so I think it was like a little bit lower value on the round trip latency, which you could achieve with a board with only 2 RAM slots instead of 4. So the difference was very, very small. But that is just my personal opinion, that what they could have done with this particular board here, when considering the target audience and what they already did to this board, as they already made it so stripped down overall. So as you can see, the whole socket area is very, very clean. They already stated on the box that it's very easy to insulate the socket area, and that is true. So there are like any large solid capacitors in the socket area. There's just this very big bank of these tantalum or pass caps or what they are, and otherwise it's very, very clean and very easy to insulate. There are some parts on this board that I don't like at all. One of the main reasons is this CMOS clear button at the socket area. It's very, very annoying. You have to be very careful when you insulate the board. You have to cut the area out, this area out from your Armaflex insulation, so that you don't accidentally press this button when you are running this motherboard, because if you press the clear CMOS button when you're running the board, you can easily damage the motherboard permanently. So they should have placed the clear CMOS button somewhere closer to the buttons, or at the Southbridge area of the motherboard, or somewhere else. The other spot here is the dip switches for your PWM frequency. it's very nice that they implemented the switching frequency option to the motherboard VRM back in those days, because it can help the voltage requirements per given clock by some degree. Of course not much, but at least somewhat some. The options are from 600 kHz to all the way to 1000 kHz or 1 MHz. When on LM2 I would always just flip all the switches so that it would lock in at 1 MHz, and then I would just forget it. You can use even a high switching frequency just on water cooling, but you have to be very careful, because especially this motherboard model, the overall heatsink assembly that connects the VRM part with the Northbridge part together, it really runs hot. So even on LM2, when you are like at -80 or -100, it is still relatively warm. So be extremely careful with the VRM part overall with this board, as it runs very hot. The switching frequency, when you increase it, it reduces the efficiency of the VRM, but it makes it faster in terms of response time, and that results in higher temperatures on the VRM. So just be careful, but it's good that they had it there. Then the biggest advantage of this board is definitely the buttons. So how does this differ? How does this differ from the Asus Rampage 3 Extreme or Black Edition? Is that you can change the CPU multiplier on the fly with this particular board, where you cannot with the Asus Rampage 3 models at all. So with all X58 CPUs, the overall operating system booting procedure is quite tough. So it's very hard to boot, like let's say 6.6 GHz on the 980X that I have, and then run it in the operating system. So with Asus Rampage 3 Extreme and Black Edition, you are only limited to base clock adjustments in the OS, and there's a bug with the newest, like modern versions of CPU-Z, that you cannot change the base clock that much in the OS. I mean, without the CPU-Z bugging the multiplier window of the CPU-Z tab or the window. So without these multiplier adjustments, you pretty much cannot get the highest CPU-Z validations on the X58 CPUs at all. Just because the CPU-Z bugs and it reads the multiplier incorrectly. I mean, for example, if I have a CPU multiplier set at 34 in the BIOS, and I boot in at 195 base clock, and then in the OS I move the base clock from 195 to, let's say, 202, it will go there, but the CPU-C starts to read the multiplier as 33 instead of 34, although the actual speed that the CPU runs will still be at 34 multiplier. So you are still running that aimed overall frequency, but the CPU-Z is reading it incorrectly, so you cannot get the highest, let's say, CPU-Z validations with methods like that. So that is very annoying. There's no way to change the multiplier with the Asus motherboards of that era, so that is very sad. I think you can set the multiplier with the EVGA boards, like the EVGA Classified, Classified 3 and the 4-way Classified. So I haven't tried those myself, but I try to find one so I can compare them. Compare one of EVGA models to these other models. So the buttons are pretty much the top feature of this board. So let's say with my CPU I could boot in at just 6.2 GHz, so 32 multiplier. And when I am the OS, I can just press the ratio up button twice, and it will set the multiplier to 34, which would be, wait, is it 6.6 or 6.8 GHz? I don't know. And at 200 base clock, and that would be just ready for benchmarking purposes. So that is very nice. These buttons do not require any additional software to work. On this platform, you don't even have to install the management engine in order to run these buttons. So that is very nice. You can change the multiplier up and down, as well as the actual base clock up and down by 1 MHz at a time, or in 0.3 of a megahertz if you press the gear button in. So now it would change from, let's say, 200 to 200.3 when I press the plus ones. So that's very nice. There's also a 4G button over here. So if you press this in, on next boot it will load 200x20 profile. So this is just a very simple overclock, but of course it varies on different CPU samples that how much voltage it requires to run. So I never used this myself, and I don't really see much point in this. And here's the start the engine button or the power button, and the blue one is the reset button. So those are the buttons, and here are all the key voltage measurement points. One voltage of note is the CPU VTT voltage on this particular motherboard model. So the X58A-OC tends to overshoot that particular voltage by quite a bit, so be very cautious if you happen to own this board, or if you are planning to get this board to test different X58 CPUs. Just be very cautious with the VTT voltage. It overshoots the VTT by around 70 millivolts. So if you set the VTT at 1.5, the actual measured value will be 1.57, and the VTT voltage is one of those voltages that can really damage the CPU permanently. So just be very careful, and especially on the Bloomfield CPUs, where base clock is the limiting factor, we really have to push the VTT voltage high in order to get the best possible clocks out from the CPU. Then they also implemented the debug LED already on board the motherboard. That is very, very nice. Many boards back in the day, even in X58 days, did not have the onboard debug LED display. So if the board didn't have this, you would have to run like a PCI debug card in the PCI slot to run the same codes for your post process. So it's nice that they had it there already. Then there you can also notice that there are two additional SATA power ports near the SATA ports. So these are just for additional power if you are running multi-GPU configurations. So this board doesn't have NF200 chips hidden underneath the Southbridge heatsink, so you cannot run 4-way SLI on this board. You can run 4-way Crossfire X, as Crossfire X doesn't require at least X8 per card in order to function, and only 3-way SLI, so 3 cards on these 3 ports. So the I think X58 supports, I think it's 32 PCI Express lanes on the CPU, but I'm not 100% sure. So this port here is X16, this is X8, this is X16, and this is X8. So if you run 2 cards, you can run X16 and X16 on here. If you run 3, it will be X16, X8, X8, and if you run 4-way Crossfire, they are all 8, I think. So that's it. Then so you should use the additional SATA ports if you run, well, at least if you run 3 cards or more on this board, and it doesn't really hurt to plug them in even if you just run 2 cards. But of course nowadays there's not really point in running 3D on a platform like this, as nowadays if you just get these older platforms, you just do 2D testing with them pretty much. So here we can see that there are 8 SATA ports, 6 of which, so these black ones here, these are the native Intel SATA 2 ports that are wired to the ICH10R Southbridge chipset. So the Southbridge on the X58 boards is exactly the same as on the P45 boards, just like the EP45T Extreme. The EP45T Extreme and this board here, they both have exactly the same Southbridge chipset. So these 6 are wired to that, and here you can see that there are 2 like gray SATA ports. These are a third party SATA 3 or SATA 6 gigabits per second ports. The important thing about here is that if you do any kind of proper overclocking, no matter if it's a 45nm CPU or a 32nm Gulftown, you should always use these third-party SATA 3 ports. The reason is that with these ports, if you have the SSD or the hard drive plugged to these, then you can reach much higher PCI Express clock speeds on the platform compared to running the drive over here. See, so then why would you have to overclock the PCI Express when you are just doing 2D? When you are trying to push for the highest possible base clocks or FSP speeds, you have to increase the PCI Express clock after some point. Usually it's after like 200 or 220 to get higher base clocks. So when you run the drive from these third-party ports, at least what I managed to get was that the best PCI Express clock I got when I ran this board, it was around like 134 or 135. So, and if I had the drive connected to one of the native Intel ones, the maximum PCI Express would be only like 110 or 115. So it's significantly lower, and that will also reduce the maximum base clock I can achieve on this platform. Now the overall difference with this motherboard model compared to the Asus Rampage 3 Black Edition was that I never managed to get that high base clock on this particular X58A-OC sample. The highest base clock I ever got with this board with my golden 920 was around 255 to 260. And using the same CPU on the Rampage 3 Black Edition, I managed to push the base clock all the way to like 275 and even above 280. And I cannot run so high PCI Express on the Asus Rampage 3 Black Edition. So maybe it's just my particular motherboard sample, but I just personally think that this board is really just for the best possible overclocking on the Gulftown. So for Bloomfield and 45nm CPUs, especially the Core i7-920, which is limited the most by base clock, there the Asus boards are usually a little bit better than the X58A-OC. But yeah, that is just my personal recommendation and experience. So just use the third-party SATA ports always when you are doing overclocking on this particular board or any other X58 board. As when we do overclocking, we generally only need one drive and maybe one DVD drive, so you can just plug them here. Now, one thing also that I would have liked to see is that they should have connected the both heatsink parts together with a heat pipe. So the overall result with this board is that this part of the heatsink, so that connects the CPU VRM, the Northbridge VRM, the actual Northbridge together. This part usually gets very, very hot, as I said before, and the Southbridge part usually remains quite cool. So if they did have a heat pipe running over here, they could like balance the temperature on the overall heatsink assembly on the board. So it would probably reduce the temperatures by a few degrees over here and transfer the heat over here. So that is just my personal opinion. Then overall about the board, so you cannot really, there are none like those small PCI Express 1X slots or 4X slots, so you cannot really mount many like additional PCI Express devices onto this board if you wanted to use this in a normal rig, in a normal case. Like for example, because this barely doesn't have any audio at all, you can see that there's like nothing over here. So if you wanted to run this in a daily rig, you should use some kind of like audio card or sound card to have some decent audio for your speakers or headphones or anything like that. You have single LAN ports, so you might be able to just use that, but if you need dual LAN, then you have to use a third-party LAN card. So just saying. Among the 4 full-length PCI Express slots, you have this single PCI slot. So this is a good for some kind of PCI like device, so like audio card, LAN card, or if you need a very low-end, very old graphics card for 2D benchmarking, then you could use a very old NVIDIA PCI graphics card on this slot. So when we try to overclock in a Windows XP environment and we aim for the best possible score in W Prime, SuperPi 1M, 32M, PiFast and things like that, we want to have the operating system as small as possible. And a good way to determine the size of the OS is to look at that how much or how many megabytes of RAM is being used all the time. And with X58 you must always install the graphics driver to get rid of the slow mode efficiency issue when it comes to performance. So the ideal situation is to use a very old NVIDIA based graphics card with the driver. So I personally use NVIDIA GeForce 6500 GT with drivers from 2005, like 14 years ago. But with this you could actually use a very old NVIDIA PCI card and use even older graphics drivers. Like you could, then it would be even smaller system. So you could minimize the passive memory use of your OS from, let's say, from like 70 megabytes or 60 megabytes to as low as like 40 or 50 megabytes. But anyways, on this board, I mean on this platform, you must always install the graphics driver, so it adds a little bit extra. Because when you push over 200 base clock or 220, you have to use the slow mode on your QPI link, and that will make everything completely slow. It will make like moving windows, moving the like the windows inside the OS very slow. It's ridiculously slow, and installing the graphics driver will fix all that. The motherboard has 7 fan connectors in total, so 2 are over here, 2 are located over here. The CPU fan connector is located over here, and then 2 more around the 24 pin. The BIOS battery is located in a very convenient spot over here. Then the board has dual BIOS, so the main BIOS and the backup BIOS, they are both located on board between the 3rd and 4th PCI Express slot. So they are soldered on the board, they are not removable chips, so just do not break both of them. So you can access both at the same time from the BIOS one when you are running the rig, so there's like no switch to choose between the two. Oh wait, there's actually a switch over here, so I think this is a switch for the BIOSes. I'm not fully sure, as I never really, I didn't have to choose to the secondary BIOS, but anyways, every proper overclocking board should always have dual BIOS, just because it's not that uncommon that the BIOS gets corrupted, so it doesn't post anymore. So you can fix the issue by flashing the main BIOS from the secondary BIOS, so that saves so much time and effort, and also RMA issues from the manufacturer's perspective. So every board should have 2 BIOSes, as it doesn't really add that much extra cost. And on EVGA boards nowadays we have 3 BIOSes, like X299 Dark, Z390 Dark, and so on. So that is very convenient. So if you happen to break both, then I guess you could desolder either of these and solder a new BIOS chip in that has a working BIOS in it. But you shouldn't have to go that far. You should just always make sure that you have working BIOS in each of the BIOS chips. So now we can take a look at the rear I/O, and it's exactly what I already said. It is extremely bare bones edition of any motherboard of this age. So you don't really have much happening over here. So you have a native PS2 connector for both mouse and keyboard. You have single LAN port over here, 2 USB 2.0 ports under the LAN port. Very simple rear I/O audio. They could have just, well, it's next to nothing, to say the least. It's very simple. Then you have 2 USB 3.0 ports. So that's pretty much it. But overall, this is a very unique board, and it's really amazing that they actually made a board like this to the retail market at least once in the whole history of PCs. So that's pretty much it. Those are my main experiences with the board, with this board, and how it compares to the Asus Rampage Extreme Black Edition. So if you are a guy like me, and if you want to aim for the best possible scores with both the Bloomfield CPUs as well as the Gulftown CPUs, you should have both this and then either of the Rampage 3 boards, the Extreme or the Black Edition. So it is not just the multiplier setting with the buttons, or the difference in base clock overclocking. There's also one key thing in the BIOS when it comes to overclocking. So with the X58A-OC, you can set the CPU PLL to much higher value than on the Asus Rampage 3 Extreme or Black Edition. So the CPU PLL voltage is the only voltage that can affect the cold pack or the cold boot pack temperature of your CPU. And usually, most of the time, a lower value over the stock 1.8 volts gives you a better cold pack temperature and also a better cold boot pack temperature. So that is just the temperature where the CPU stops functioning or it doesn't want to boot anymore. And usually the cold pack on these CPUs is that it just shuts down. Same on 775, it will just shut down at some specific temperature. So and most of the time, a lower value than 1.8 volts made the cold pack temperature better. So for example, if your cold pack was minus 140 and 1.8 volts, and if you lowered it to like 1.4 or 1.5 volts, you could get the CPU to minus 170 or even to full pot. But then there are some weird CPU samples that like higher voltage than low value, but these are quite rare. So the 980X that I ran, it had exactly the same cold pack temperature and cold boot pack temperature, no matter if the CPU PLL was at 1.4 volts or at 2.0 volts. And the highest voltage you can set with the Rampage 3 Extreme or Black Edition is 2.05. And when of course I tested this a lot, so a lower value than 1.4 volts on that specific chip made the cold pack and the cold boot pack worse than 1.4 or any other value. And I had a similar CPU like 2 years ago that happened to like really high value. So that weird CPU sample, it had a cold pack temperature of minus 150 I think, or minus 145 at any value that was lower than 2.15. And when I set the CPU PLL to 2.2 or even 2.25, I could go to full pot. But that CPU wasn't that good. Even with full pot temperature, it didn't really overclock that good. It was like 6.2 max, so it wasn't that spectacular. But I want to try the same thing with the 980X that I have now. Go to 2.15 and 2.2 plus on the PLL and see if that is the magic switch to get the CPU temperature pass minus 170 to full pot temperature. Because if I cannot reach full pot, there's no way I can challenge the top guys at the Super Pi category or Pi Fast, like High Cookie and similar guys who made their scores back in 2010 and 11. So I need that temperature to be able to challenge the other guys in those benchmarks. I'm sure I can get the W Prime 1024 amp, but that just requires a little bit of time, as I didn't have that much LN2 for the previous attempt. That I only used the last bits of LN2 that I had to test the brand new CPU that I got, and I'm really happy about it. I hope that it just lasts for a long time and doesn't get doesn't degrade or anything, or doesn't die. That's what I just hope. So the CPU PLL is the difference. So with this board you can go much higher in the CPU PLL than on Asus Rampage boards. I think the maximum is like 2.4 or 2.3, maybe 2.4 on this board, when it was only like 2.05 on the Rampage 3 Black Edition. So there is that. But also you cannot set the VCO as high on this board. So the highest value you can set on the VCO is only like 1.93, when you can go past like 2 volts on the Rampage 3. The Gulftown CPUs really scale well in terms of VCO for non-hyperthreading tests like Super Pi or Pi Fast. So that is a minus. So yeah, so that is my overall overview of the board and all my experiences when it comes to this board and X58 boards overall. So this board really doesn't have that much connectivity at all. You can see that there's, of course, you have simple front panel audio for your case, single front panel USB for your case, then all the rest of the front panel connections over here. There's no USB 3.0 for your case or anything like that. That's pretty much it. So this is a pure stripped down bare bones motherboard for overclocking. It has its place in the history of overclocking. It's one of the most notable motherboards in terms of being targeted to overclocking audience and so on. So this is a really nice piece of hardware to have in my collection, and I'm really looking forward to keeping it there. And I really hope that I will get the result that I'm hoping for when it comes to the 980X. If you have any questions or comments, if you have anything from your own experience about this board, then please leave them down below and I will try to answer them. If you like this video, if you want to see more about some legendary hardware, mainly motherboards, I have many motherboards to cover still, then please like and share this video and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you on the next one.